After the successful remake for Final Fantasy VII, I kind of found myself wanting more. So I went on a journey seeking that Final Fantasy experience that would really scratch my itch. And upon doing so, I stumbled upon a lesser appreciated title within the Final Fantasy family. The initial release of Final Fantasy XV was very staggered. It came with a very incomplete story, the characters felt very fragmented and forced, and the only really in-depth character building we had was more towards the end of the game's runtime. So within the last maybe 5 hours or so, you really began to appreciate the characters and their more in-depth traits, their, lesser shining through moments and so on. The only issue with that was by the time that you actually found yourself enjoying the characters, it was over. The game just kind of fell flat. And the reason it fell flat was because the ending wasn't really anything to write home about either. So I kind of stumbled upon this game again after 4 years or so of it being out, and I have to say, the lack of character depth, I kind of noticed that after 4 years they've ironed it all out, and in doing so, the game is something a lot more than it used to be. The character development was handled very well through 3 DLCs, 4 counting episode Ardyn, which we will touch on in this video. Episode Gladiolus was the first to launch, and in this we started to appreciate Gladiolus's more soft traits. The fact that once he realised he wasn't strong enough as the King's Shield, he took himself on a reflective journey to show his commitment to not only Noctis, but his commitment to the cause, his job as a shield. In doing this, Gladiolus, instead of being this muscle meathead who was just constantly pissed off all the time, we got to appreciate the fact that he was more of a big brother towards everybody, as he had to be with his younger sister Iris. And then Episode Prompto came out. With Episode Prompto, you find out Prompto's prior life, but in this, Prompto goes on a journey of self-discovery in which he understands and learns that even though he himself doesn't appreciate what he is and who he is, other people do. In this DLC, he goes on a self-reflective journey just as Gladiolus does, because he thinks that Noctis doesn't like him and that he isn't like the other friends that Noctis has. Within this, instead of Prompto being the humorous airhead of the group, you kind of understand a bit more about his loss of humanity, I want to say, or his lack thereof. And throughout the DLC, his commitment to others as much as himself really shone through, and in that DLC, I've got to say, they took a lot of time into building up the characters. And the final one that launched within the first year of its life cycle was Episode Ignis. Within Episode Ignis, you take control of Ignis during the, I believe it's Altissia storyline. In this, you get to really appreciate the fact that Ignis isn't just this smart-ass character who's there just to bring a dynamic to the fore. Instead, he's got a lot more depth to him regarding his selflessness and the fact that he devotes himself to others more than he actually does himself. Within the DLC, Ignis dons the Ring of the Lucii, knowing full well that the cost could be his life. He does so because he's devoted to his friends, he's devoted to saving, everybody else at the cost of himself, which is something that we otherwise didn't really get from the game. I've got to say, of all of the base characters, Gladiolus was my favourite because he at least had a dynamic that shifted throughout the story. Now, there's loads of different things that went wrong with Final Fantasy XV's initial launch, but this video is more so to give you an in-depth look at how it is now. 4 years later, they've focused on character development. Yes, it was through DLC, and I'm not encouraging that games do character development and other major plot aspects through DLC. However, I'm just here to say, the character development, I don't have a problem with it. I've not finished a New Game Plus, as I don't want to. I don't want that end to happen, because now I find myself in love with not only the characters, but the universe that they're in. And the reason I find myself in that position is because other than just the movie that was launched for Final Fantasy XV, Kingsglaive, if you haven't watched it, go and watch it, it's phenomenal. On to my other point, within that movie, they really built up the world and what existed around our characters. We really kind of got dragged through it though. A movie has a set runtime and there's certain aspects they have to do. They couldn't do everything, and that was kind of where Final Fantasy 15 fell off, because instead of building up its unique world, it just felt like it tried to tie together all of what makes up a Final Fantasy game. You know, there was not really anything unique that broke Final Fantasy 15 into its own universe. Which brings me to another point, actually. The reason Final Fantasy 15 also fell out of, touch with most players is the combat was so incredibly flat. Whereas other Final Fantasy titles had a focus on your entire party and you strategically playing through damage, healing, buffing, analyzing, and so on and so forth. With Final Fantasy 15, you had a team of 4, which I believe was the largest party size that we've had in a Final Fantasy game leading up to now. And that 4-man squad took more out of it than it actually gave, because instead of you controlling all characters individually and controlling what spells are cast and so on, you kind of just sat there as the main protagonist, Noctis, whose skill set wasn't limited. He could equip every type of weapon, every kind of spell, and he was a lot easier to build. Felt like Noctis, they kind of gave you everything. Most of his moves were spamming B and moving the movement stick, which in my opinion doesn't really fit combat styles for other Final Fantasy games. You build up your ATB gauge, and doing so, you can then select individual moves for to use, like Gladiolus, Ignis, and Prompto. They all have very unique combo style moves that you can use after building up ATB gauge. And that was it. The combat was so much more fluid and interesting from the other character's point of view, or at least we assumed it would. And then with the release of these DLCs, we actually got to play as them, and we got to appreciate combat from their perspective, so you could see it through the eyes of Gladiolus instead of being an all-around kind of powerhouse balanced unit like Noctis is. He was more of a heavy attacks, heavy defense, and counter-based, so you really had to time your blocks to get those parries, to build up something unique to him, which was, instead of him having a limit burst, he had a rage meter, and the more his rage meter built up, the more damage he dealt. And it was really cool. It was so dynamic compared to what Noctis's was. You spammed that one button, you built up the limit burst, you used it, and the fight was over. With the DLCs released, so 4 years later, we've got a lot more of a dynamic combat system. I've said that word a lot, by the way. Take a shot every time I've said dynamic, you won't survive. But you appreciate the dynamic for all of these other combats, because now you can seamlessly switch between Gladiolus, Prompto, Noctis, and Ignis and take control of their unique combat kits, their own play styles and their own functions, instead of being limited to just Noctis, the base player. Prompto plays more of like a very weak Gears of War game, which is a comparison I never thought I'd make, Gears of War and Final Fantasy, but there you go, it's out there now. With Ignis, he had something called Total Clarity, which was kind of like a passive building limit burst. However, it was kind of like you build this thing up and he launches a flurry of all of his different unique combat elements all at once, and in doing so you can stagger enemies, you can inflict them with weakness such as stun, bleed, and fire. Typical Final Fantasy debuffs. All of these that you could access 4 years on were really what we needed as players to fully appreciate its combat. And now that they've fixed that, I do understand why people were pissed off with the game, why I myself couldn't fully appreciate the combat. And now that they fixed that, though, wow, it's phenomenal. It's an experience for the ages. And that leads me on to my next point, which would be the changes to the story. The story, as far as I'm concerned, is phenomenal now. It's perfect. It's everything that we missed, we now get. With this combat change, it all came within something called the Royal Edition, the Royal Pack. And in this Royal Pack, we gained access to that combat style and an extension to Chapter 14 within the game, which is your return to Insomnia. And in this, you scout the tower with the remnants of the legendary Kingsglaive. These are the ultimate elite guard for, Insomnia, for the kings, for the prince, and so on. And it's really cool because it fleshes out the external universe on top of doing this. It's really phenomenal. It's so much more of a better experience than the one that we got, but it really fleshed out the story and gave you an extension onto the final chapters, which are, again, still, even 4 years later, in my opinion, the best parts of the game. And in this extension within the Royal Edition, you gain access to the extended, like, chapter 14, which was everything and more. It's what the story needed. It fleshed out the final moments of Noctis, the character development that he went through, and the extension to chapter 14 expands on this. He gives a rousing speech to the Kingsglaive, something he was always shy and scared of doing. He takes his place as the king instead of prince. So within episode Gladiolus, we've been able to experience Gladio's reflective nature, his commitment to Noctis. Prompto, we've been able to understand his courage, why he suffers with, like, his confidence around other people. Within Ignis, we've managed to, better grasp his selflessness, his devotion to other people. We've had an extension to the story which really fleshed it out. So far, everything's going good in Final Fantasy XV story. And then they released this, I want to say it was like an advert or a teaser for a second season pass. Of the 3 DLCs in that season pass, sadly we only received episode Ardyn, and the reason why we only received that one was due to the fact that the community wasn't a fan of Final Fantasy XV, even to date. And it was kind of sad. However, with episode Ardyn, they gave so much backstory for the villain. And a personal problem I had with the villain was I loved him too much. Ardyn was my favourite character in Final Fantasy XV, and the reason for this was his enigmatic nature. The fact that every time he was on the screen, you questioned what his ideals were, why he was doing what he was doing, what led him down the path that he takes. And within episode Ardyn, we got to discover that. We actually got a first-hand look at Ardyn's past life, not only Ardyn's past life, but all of the build-up to Final Fantasy XV story and the huge impact that drove his hatred towards not only Noctis, but the bloodline of Noctis. Ardyn within the game is presented as an enigma, and that was the issue. Ardyn was so much of a lovable character and you didn't understand anything about him, so when the final fight happens, or the final reveal happens of him being the villain, there was no reason to it. You didn't know why he was the villain. You didn't know what happened when, his eyes start seeping black. Like, what the hell is that? There was nothing that gave you closure on Ardyn. And when he dies at the end of the game, you kind of sat there and you felt not only empty for the characters because you finally started to love them, but you felt empty on the fact that now Ardyn, the only character besides Gladiolus that in my opinion was enjoyable throughout the game, was dead. Not only that, it was you that had to kill him. So, it was really difficult to take to begin with, but episode Ardyn really fleshes out the character with his backstory. You find out that he was the chosen king to rid darkness from the land. However, his brother at the time, Somnus, so Regis's and Noctis's ancestor, wasn't essentially a fan of such. He was jealous of Ardyn, and in doing so, he sought to destroy Ardyn's legacy and put an end to the prophecy. With this, Ardyn's future wife, we'll call it, or girlfriend at the time, was killed, and that caused Ardyn to lose his mind, if you will. He became insane and became infected with the game's main entity, or main evil entity, the Star Scourge. With this, he became the villain and was locked away in Angel Guard, which is the place where Noctis wakes up after his 10-year slumber before he wakes up all cool and mature and stuff. But in this DLC, you get to grasp everything that broke Ardyn, and in this DLC, not only do you get to grasp that, but you get to look at what drove him insane in the fact that he wakes up after being locked there for, I think it's like 2,000 years or something, and he's still of the mind frame that he deserves to be locked there, and that he's lost everything, that he's kind of lost. He's like a lost puppy, and he's found by the Empire, which is then where his path starts to go from, I'm gonna do the right thing and lock myself away because it's what she would have wanted, to I need to kill them, I need to get the revenge that I'm after, which is great because it goes to show the mental decline from the chosen hero to the chosen villain. And something I did like about this was we find out that he was the prophesized king. Going then to the future of the game, Final Fantasy XV's ending, we get to discover the fact that he did still fulfill the prophecy, because he became, instead of the one to defeat the darkness, the one to harbor it, to vessel it inside of himself. And then when Noctis defeats him, of which we find out was planned by the god Bahamut, the Esper god, however you want to go about it, Bahamut, who contacted Ardyn after he was about to enact revenge, you find out that Ardyn still fulfilled his prophecy and that he kind of does get his happy ending. So the episode Ardyn kind of really did tie up that final bow. And I think that's going to take us to like the ending of this video. Is 4 years later with the DLC. Granted, it sucks that you have to have the DLC. However, if you're lucky enough to be on Xbox and have the Game Pass Ultimate at the moment, you can get the Royal Edition of Final Fantasy XV for free. And that's the conclusion of this video. 4 years later, the game is free for Xbox users. It's relatively cheap at the moment. I think last time I checked over here in the UK for the Royal Edition, it's £30 max. And 4 years later, in conclusion to everything that's changed, all of the rights that they've wronged, I have to say, you need to pick it up. Final Fantasy XV, especially for us Xbox users that don't have access to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, is the next best thing. Yes, there was so much wrong with its initial release, but 4 years later, they fixed it. The characters are so deep and there's so much raw energy coming from them that you find yourself loving not only them, but their unique personality traits that they don't only bring to the group of 4 bros, but to themselves and to Noctis. All of these differences within characters go towards shaping the mature Noctis that we get at the end of the story, and it's really cool and unique to being able to experience those kind of blanks within the story. That's essentially the message I want to give in this video. 4 years later, Final Fantasy XV is finally the game that we hoped it would be. It's finally worth that 10-year wait that we had leading up to it. Not only that, it's finally the game that can usher in a new era of Final Fantasy games for a whole new generation of heroes to go and conquer the worlds of Eos or, you know, whatever they're going through. And I think getting hands-on with Final Fantasy VII on my stepfather's PlayStation, I have to say, it's undeniable that the Final Fantasy VII Remake took its combat system from Final Fantasy XV. The summon system is identical to 15, but that's the thing, this game that was considered such a fail was a huge success. It was something that has inspired the new, well, I don't really want to say new, but it is new in its own way. It not only brought itself back from the dead, but it's inspired and changed one of the most iconic stories within Final Fantasy, that is 7. The editing on this video has now been done in a new editing software. I hope it's not too choppy, I hope it's not too blocky. Any feedback, as always, is appreciated in the comments. And please just leave a like, dislike, depending on however you enjoyed the video. I'll probably even do a little poll card up in the top right, I believe it is. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Subscribing to the channel means that I can continue to deliver content like this, as well as walkthroughs, as well as giveaways. Anyway, that's going to cut it. Please, hope you're all taking care of yourself. Stay at home, stay safe. Love you all, and I'll see you in another world. Take care.